Happy New Year. Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Mr. Thomas Lockley, who will be presenting on Yasuke, African Samurai. Mr. Thomas Lockley is an associate professor at Nihon University College of Law in Tokyo. He has researched and published a number of historical figures, but is primarily known for his work on Yasuke, which has been featured in Japan on NHK, BS-TBS, TV Tokyo, Fuji Television, as well as receiving many notable reviews, including in print media like Mainichi Shinbun. The English language version of his book, co-authored with Geoffrey Girard, African Samurai, was released by Hanover Square Press in the US in April 2019. Mr. Lockley's latest book is A Gentleman from Tokyo, the untold story of an incredible journey to Asia, to Queen Elizabeth's court, which will be released in the US on May 21st of this year. It tells the astonishing story of the first Japanese man to set foot in the Americas and the British Isles. To read more about Mr. Lockley's biography, please refer to the YCAP's website. Mr. Lockley, it is a pleasure to have you with us here today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for coming to listen to this talk this morning. I can see some familiar faces out there, and welcome to them, and welcome to everybody else as well. Firstly, I'm just going to say that I have prepared this presentation for people who are not necessarily familiar with Japanese history. So please bear with me if some of the terms are slightly simplified, and if you want to ask any specific questions, there's plenty of time to ask questions at the end of the talk. Okay, my name is Thomas Lockley. I work for Nihon University. It's my pleasure to be here for about the fourth time, I think, in YCAPS, and this is probably the third time I've done this Yasuke African Samurai talk, and I've done another one about Tomoe Gozen and Hojo Masako as well, which was done about 2 years ago, I think. So let's start. Today I will be talking first of all about the background to Yasuke's world, then his meeting with Nobunaga in 1581, his investiture as a samurai also in 1581, on campaign that year and the year afterwards, and of his last battle and Yasuke today. I just realized that in the background there is some construction going on. I hope that it doesn't disrupt everything too much. Okay, Yasuke. Yasuke was, of course, a man, and he lived in the 16th century. So a little bit of background to the world that he knew. He was almost definitely at some point human trafficked from somewhere in Africa, and he was trafficked east, almost definitely towards India. We don't know the details of his background, but I have hypothesized in various different ways through research-based stories, which you can read within the book if you want to. He arrived in Japan in 1579. Japan was not the peaceful place that we know today. Japan was embroiled in civil war and had been for around about 100 years. So if you can imagine a world which has been at war since about what we would think of as the First World War, more than 100 years ago, you can get a feeling of the kind of turmoil that Yasuke arrived in Japan in. He arrived as the bodyguard of a Jesuit missionary. He was a kind of mercenary soldier. The Jesuits had been active in Japan since 1549, when the first missionary, who was called Francis Xavier, arrived. He arrived with a team of others. We only remember his name, but within his team were Chinese, Japanese, and Indian missionaries as well. Yasuke, we know, was employed by a man called Alessandro Valliano, who was the most important Catholic in whole of Asia. And he was employed by Valliano somewhere around 1577, almost definitely in India, probably in what is now the state of Goa. In 1579, they arrived in Japan on a boat onto the Shimabara Peninsula. And between 1579 and 1581, Yasuke spent most of the time in Kyushu or the islands around it. Okay. Artwork is our best way of looking at people from this time because we can see what the people saw through their own eyes. Africans were not rare at all in Western Japan, especially in Kyushu, and had been arriving in Japan for perhaps 30 or 40 years by the time Yasuke was there. However, as we shall see later, there are many, many parts of Japan where there had never been any Africans, and this is partly why Yasuke became such a popular figure within the country. You can see here some Africans in Nagasaki. We have a bodyguard here with a spear, something similar to perhaps what Yasuke would have looked like. We have here a standard bearer. Just to our right here on the screen, there is a diplomatic mission, and these men are in attendance to that mission. This man here is carrying a tray of bread. This man is carrying some silk. This man is carrying a chair, perhaps for the ambassador to sit on. And behind the other side, we have various exotic animals which are being led as presents to the Japanese lords who these men were coming to talk to. Okay, I have another picture here. Again, a man slightly similar to what Yasuke may have looked like. This man carries a bow with a quiver down here. He's a warrior, as Yasuke would have been. These are the diplomats, Europeans in general, but also some would have been mixed race with Indians. And we have various servants and or slaves, particularly in this man's case. This man, as we can see, the Japanese artist has portrayed him in a very difficult position. He's got his head in his hands. He's not very well dressed, and he's got a big bag to carry. Whereas these far, far better dressed attendants up here are clearly of much higher status. And Yasuke would have been one of these higher status people. So we don't hear much about Yasuke until 1581, but what we do know is where he was, because he was with Valiano. However, in 1581, Valiano goes to Kyoto, what was then called Miyako, to ask permission to leave Japan. He wants to continue the mission or leave people to continue his mission, but he needs essentially what we would now call a passport leave to escape from Japan and go to wherever else he needs to go, which in this case was Macau. He goes with Yasuke through the inland sea, and they arrive at Sakai, which is now just to the west of Osaka. They're mobbed, basically, because even if Africans have been fairly common in the west of Japan, and particularly in the Nagasaki region, they had probably never been seen in Sakai and Kyoto. And this was something that the locals thought was amazing. They mobbed the procession. They got on top of houses to be on the roofs so they could see better. Some of those houses collapsed because there was too many people on the roof. People were crushed in the crowds. And by the time several riots had happened, one of them took place very close to where the most powerful man in Japan, Nobunaga, was. Nobunaga was disturbed. Why is this riot happening within 5 minutes of where I am staying? And he demands to see who is disturbing his peace. So the day of destiny, essentially, for Yasuke and also for Nobunaga, he is taken to Nobunaga, and Nobunaga is quite clearly astonished. He's impressed with Yasuke's Japanese skill. He's got perfectly good conversational Japanese, the records say. However, Nobunaga did not believe that this man was actually black. In something which today we'd see as very unpolitically correct, he had Yasuke asked Yasuke to strip to the waist, produced a brush, and brushed the skin. Of course, Yasuke's skin color didn't change in the slightest, and Nobunaga had a kind of epiphany and realized that this man was actually true. Some people have hypothesized that he thought that this was a publicity stunt for the Jesuits, something to boost their mission. But actually, of course, Yasuke was a real person and had truly black skin. So Nobunaga has realized this. He sends for his sons. He throws a party for his guest. And at the end of the party, at the end of the evening, he gifts a very large sum of money, 10,000 copper coins, or thereabouts, is what's recorded. And quite instantly, Yasuke is a rich man. He's been entertained by the most important man in Japan, and he's become rich all in one day. If you can get your mind around that, it must have been a big day for him. At some point after this, Nobunaga asks Faliano to allow Yasuke into his service. We don't know exactly how this happened or when it happened, but we know that it was in March 1581 at some point. So Yasuke then becomes a retainer, a follower of this man. This man is Oda Nobunaga. He's probably the most famous, perhaps infamous man in Japanese history. And due to Yasuke's connection with Nobunaga, we are left with records of Yasuke as well. So in many circumstances, people like Yasuke have slipped through the cracks of history, quite simply because they were in the background. They were illiterate, they were in the background, they were not of the scholarly classes or the aristocratic classes, but were the people that did the real work. Unfortunately, in history, we've often forgotten about these people. So Yasuke's example of being a man who has been remembered despite his class and his status is actually quite exceptional. Oda Nobunaga was a man who was in the process of trying to reunify Japan and impose peace by force of arms. He had got around perhaps a third to half of the way of reunifying Japan at this time. So why did Nobunaga find Yasuke so interesting? Well, first of all, he was a giant. This is a man who is approximately 188 centimeters, that's 6 foot something. Sorry, I'm not very good in old measurements. That's something just over 6 foot. Is a giant in this age. The average height of Japanese people at the time is thought to have been around 150 to 155. So he is a good 30 centimeters, a good foot higher than most of the other people around. He is recorded in Japanese sources to have been good looking, intelligent, entertaining, and perhaps most importantly for a warrior class, he had the strength of 10 men. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that he was actually as strong as 10 men. It's a figure of speech, meaning that he was super, super strong. There's also something else which is not written down anywhere. It is not necessarily painted in any pictures, but during my research, I found out that the Buddha, this time Shakyamuni, was often portrayed as black-skinned in Japan and possibly further around in the East as well. It's quite probable that many people saw Yasuke as a kind of divine visitor, not quite a human, but more towards the divine level, and he was gracing them with his presence. He wasn't just simply there, he was there as a visitor from some other. There's no definite evidence to prove that. However, given the reaction to him and given the circumstances around deities and semi-divine characters at the time and what they look like and still do. If you go to shrines and temples in Japan, you will often see people with darker skins portrayed, people with red skins, people even with blue skins. And therefore the people may well have been thinking along those lines. So first of all, he is something new for Nobunaga, a new kind of servant, a new kind of attendant. He's soon appointed the weapon bearer. A weapon bearer was a position of very high respect. If you are respectful enough to carry your lord's weapons, and trusted enough to carry your lord's weapons and not be about to kill him with those same weapons, then you are one of the most important people in that lord's entourage. Yasuke was appointed to this position. The records that the Jesuits left, not the Japanese records, the Jesuits' records state that Nobunaga couldn't talk to him enough. He went to see him, he just carried on talking to him. We don't know what they talked about, but what were the logical things for them to talk about? Well, I would say war, weapons, overseas ways of fighting, tactics, strategies, and also perhaps things like hunting, the kind of things that warriors got up to as their hobbies in their free time. Yasuke was eventually, probably a couple of months later, we're not sure exactly when, he was given a residence in Azuchi Castle, which was Nobunaga's brand new castle in the middle of a new capital city. He was given a stipend. We're not sure how much, but it must have been quite considerable. He was given servants of his own, and most importantly for our story and for the title of the book, African Samurai, he was given a sword, which is traditionally seen as the formal recognition of a samurai rank. Purists are going to say, what does samurai mean at this time in history? And that question is a very good question, because this is a very fluid time in Japanese history before samurai has been made into a caste. It is, at this point, very fluid. People from very humble backgrounds, including peasants and even people of lower class than that, could become respected warriors. And therefore, it's not unreasonable to say that he was given the rank of a samurai. And most people in Japan hold by this. Historians do call him the first samurai of non-Japanese descent. It's not just me saying that, that is a fairly common thing to be said. Here we have one of the most amazing artworks. Firstly, because this is not just any African in the middle here. You can see a very dark-skinned man in the middle. This almost definitely is Yasuke. He's engaging in a sumo match. To the right, you can see 10 men waiting, and he's sumo wrestling the man in the middle. You can see to your left, Nobunaga. He's kind of half undressed in this picture, with his lover resting on his knee. Though you can't see the rest of the painting, the people on the left are very much having a party and watching the sumo, and the people on the right are the sumo wrestlers waiting to have a fight with Yasuke. You can tell he's Yasuke by looking up very close, because his hair is definitely not Japanese, his face shape is definitely not Japanese, and of course his skin color is very much darker than everybody else. It's believed that this picture was in the castle at Azuchi. This is another artwork showing a very, very high, very, very tall African man at the time in Japan. This African is not wearing Japanese clothes, he's wearing Portuguese clothes. But he does have two swords in the Japanese manner. However, they're not Japanese swords, they are Portuguese swords or European swords. So again, it's possible that this is Yasuke. He's wearing extremely fine silken shoes as well, though we're not quite sure. It could be another very rich African man from the time in Japan. This is a picture of the castle itself, where he lived. Sadly, we don't know where he lived on the mountain, but it was likely to have been quite close to the top, because it's recorded that he was called into Nobunaga's presence quite often, and they talked for a long time. So you can still see the castle itself on the mountain. However, the top donjon up here has long gone in fire, and many of the residences, although some have been recreated, most of them are not there anymore. Okay, so what happened after he became Nobunaga's samurai? Well, first of all, he went on campaign once, possibly twice or three times. I suspect that Yasuke was probably a bit of a fad for Nobunaga at first. However, what happens after that shows that he soon won his lord's trust. There's the weapon bearer, there's the confidant, there's the other points about being given money, house, servants, etc. But then we know that he went into battle with Nobunaga. The first time that's recorded is in June 1582. So that's just over a year after he entered Nobunaga's service. They had been waiting for an opportunity to attack east to what is just behind Mount Fuji for a long, long time. Nobunaga found an opportunity, sent his son in with a large army. The son destroyed everything, took over the province, what's now Kai, or what was called Kai province, the province of Takeda, and then Yasuke goes with Nobunaga to find out what the conditions on the ground are. Sorry, I've just made a small error. The June 1582 is the second time he goes into battle with Nobunaga. They are heading out for the west, for what is now Okayama, and the General Hideyoshi had requested help. He was fighting the Mori clan there, and Nobunaga set out with an army, or 3 armies actually, and he himself got on a horse with about 30 close people in his entourage, including Yasuke. They rode one day to Kyoto and stayed the night in Kyoto. And this is June 20th, 1582. The next day, Akechi Mitsuhide, who was one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, betrayed him. He brought his 13,000 soldiers, which should have been heading out west to fight on Nobunaga's behalf. He put them against Nobunaga's 30 people entourage. Of course, there was absolutely no hope whatsoever. These 13,000, of course, were going to prevail against 30. Nobunaga was forced to perform seppuku, and by legend, there's no proof of this, but by legend, his last order is Yasuke, save my head. Why saving somebody's head? Well, because the head is a powerful symbol of legitimacy. So if you have taken somebody else's head, you can hold it up and say, look, I've killed this man, I now take his power. In those days, that was a very powerful form of legitimacy, and Akechi could have used that head to say, I'm the new ruler of this realm. Yasuke stopped him from doing that by taking the head to Nobunaga's heir, Nobutada, who was about 5 to 10 minutes walk away in a temple nearby called the Myokakuji. Nobutada didn't last very long. The 13,000 soldiers descended upon him. He himself performed seppuku, and Yasuke, in the end, surrenders. We don't know exactly how that was, whether he was wounded or whether he surrendered unilaterally. Whatever happened, he was returned to the Jesuit church. Akechi had remembered that he'd come from the Jesuits originally, and that is the last record of Yasuke. The Jesuits wrote down that they gave thanks to God for Yasuke's deliverance from the battle, and that's it. We don't have any more information about Yasuke. This is a picture of the Honnoji incident, the battle at which Yasuke's last battle, but also Nobunaga's last battle. And this is the only surviving picture of the Jesuit church in Kyoto. You can see it's built within the Japanese manner. It looks almost like a temple or a pagoda, perhaps. However, it was 3 stories high in a city of which everything was 1 story, or pretty much every building was 1 story. So it stuck up high and could be seen from much of the city. And that did not endear the Jesuits to many of the locals. So Yasuke disappears from history in 1582. We don't think that he died, though we have no proof as to whether that is a conclusion or not. He didn't die in the battle anyway. He obviously died sometime soon after that. At that point, we can look to various other Africans who were recorded in Japan at the time and think, oh, was this Yasuke? Was this Yasuke? And there are several people that kind of fit into that possible Yasuke genre, maybe 2 or 3 men. However, there's no definitive proof that he's ever recorded in history. If you want to find out more details about that, there's a whole chapter on it in the book, and you can get that book in libraries in the US, quite a lot of libraries here in Japan as well, and also you can, of course, buy the book if you feel that way inclined. But I'm going to go on to Yasuke today, because Yasuke was forgotten for around about 400 years. He was only vaguely remembered in the 1990s. He starts to, sorry, in the 1960s, he appears as a character in a children's book. And then in the 1990s, he appears once or twice in television dramas about Nobunaga or about Hideyoshi on NHK in particular. Excuse me. However, we have to wait till this century for him to be truly reborn as a fully formed character, as a fully formed man. And in the last 20 years, we've seen him in computer games as playable character in computer games. We've seen him in anime, both as the main character in anime and also as supporting characters or mangas. There's movies. Somebody pointed out a movie about him only yesterday called Yasuke Descendants. I haven't had a chance to watch it yesterday, but apparently it's on Netflix right now. I've heard of various up to 10 to 15 projects for real movies, both in Japan and in the US and indeed in Europe. There have been books written about him, both factual, like mine, and fictional books based on his life in several continents now. He's appeared as character in the theatre, on just television, even on children's television here in Japan. I've seen him, or an actor portraying him, of course. And as I was researching and writing the book, I found out that this man has become a serious source of inspiration to people around the world. Talking to people from all sorts of different places, I found out that they saw Yasuke's life as something to help them in their lives. If Yasuke could go through all the trials and tribulations that he did and still succeed in a foreign culture, far from home, with not particularly that much support until he built the support through his own actions, then they can too. And one of the reasons I wrote the book in the first place was because I found that Yasuke was this source of inspiration. And I think that is perhaps one of the most special things we can say about this man today. I'm going to go through, to finish off the talk, I'm going to go through some of his portrayals in popular fiction, popular culture right now. This is him in the computer game Nihon. He's a playable character. He's actually a baddie in this one, which is good, because normally he's a goodie, and of course I'm sure he's a very, very goody person in heart, but it's nice to see a baddie portrayal as well. We have him here in another computer game. Name has escaped me right now. Nobunaga no Yabo, it's called in Japanese. This is the first time he was in a computer game, about 10 to 15 years ago. And we have him portrayed here as part of a theatre production called Momoyama Beat Tribe. This is originally a book, it turned into an anime and also into a manga and a theatre. And I've heard that it's also been on television as well. He's one of 4 characters. They're down on their luck in this difficult time in Japanese history. Yasuke has just lost his lord, and they all get together and they make a band. And the adventures of Yasuke in that are what forms the basis of the book. Finally, excuse me, promotion of this book. If you're in Japan, you would be seeing this version, and there's a QR code here. If you're in the USA, you would see this version. There is a QR code there as well. There are ebooks. There are also audiobooks as well. Sometimes you can get those on offer for free or for only a couple of dollars. So if you're waiting to look out for one of those deals, please, I hope you can do that. Finally, my new book, it's called A Gentleman from Japan, which chronicles a similar story to Yasuke's, but from the opposite perspective. A Japanese man in difficult circumstances who travels abroad and makes a life for himself in exactly the same period in the 1580s and 1590s. It's going to be launched in North America for 21st of May. I'm told it's an ideal Father's Day present. The QR code should take you to a place where you can find that. It actually tells the story of a man who, well, he made his life in England in the end, in London around Queen Elizabeth I's court. However, he was also the first Japanese person recorded, first Asian person recorded on North American soil and also South American soil as well. So his story is another pioneering story of adversity and diversity as well. And I hope you enjoy it. If there are any questions about that, as well as questions about Yasuke, I would be very happy to talk about that now. Okay. Amani, thank you very much. I'll put it over to you for now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lockley, for that awesome presentation. I have so many questions that I'd like to ask, and I'm sure everyone else would as well. So to essentially begin our Q&A session, I wanted to ask, do we know, or do we have an idea about perhaps where in Africa Yasuke was from, and also kind of how old he might have been during this time when he arrived in Japan, or at least?
Yep. I'll deal with the age first because we have a definite witness testament to that. When he arrived at Nobunaga's court, he was described as being 25 or 26. In Japanese years, because in those days they counted birth as 1 year old, that means 1 year extra, 1 year less, yeah, in European count at that time. So around 25, 24 perhaps, meaning that when he leaves history, he's then a year and a half to 2 years older. So he leaves history before he's 30 years old. Where did he come from in Africa is a very, very good question. Again, you can see my reasoning and why I believe these things in the book, because it goes into quite a lot of detail. I personally believe that he is from what is now southern Sudan or western Ethiopia, mainly because of his description, his height, his strength, and the fact that the Japanese sources describe him as having skin the color of black ink. So you can see this black ink here, of this calligraphy. His skin was described as being that black. If you look around Africa, you'll find that the darkest skin and the tallest people and perhaps the strongest people are from that region of what is now southern Sudan. However, there is a record from about 30 or 40 years later, a Jesuit record saying that he's from Mozambique. And there's also one curious letter that refers to a man, or a very young man, a boy at the time, who could have been Yasuke, who left Mozambique with Valiano as a slave. He'd been given as a gift, if you can give a human being as a gift, in around 1574. So this is about 7 or 8 years before he enters the actual history book. Whether this is Yasuke or not, we don't know. But he was there with Valiano from Mozambique. There's one last point about that. If he was in what is now the country of Mozambique, that doesn't mean he actually came from there. He could have traveled or been transported from all sorts of places. Therefore, it's very difficult. The only thing I can say with definite, I think everybody can say with definite, is that he's from somewhere in the east of Africa.
I see. Yeah, I assumed that perhaps because, as you mentioned, his height, that
Yeah.
my first thought was maybe Sudan, because I realized they have some of the tallest people
Oh,
on the African continent.
yeah. And I mean, he was tall by any standards in those days, perhaps one of the tallest people in the world at the time. I mean, we're very much better fed these days. We've been through several hundred years of evolution. For 188 centimeters to not be that tall today, 6'2" or something like that, not that tall. Even so, somebody who's 6'2" stands out, whatever country in the world they're in. And so therefore, 400 years ago, he would have been quite something, I think.
Definitely. My other question, before we get into the questions in the chat, I wanted to know, so you mentioned in maybe was one of your last slides that Yasuke had been forgotten for about 400 years. Obviously, we know about Nobunaga because he's a big figure in Japan, and it's really hard to, not come across him in history or even in museum or photos or paintings and things of that nature. Now that there's kind of this resurgence of knowing more about Yasuke, are we seeing that there's kind of a push to try to perhaps place him in museums, or, if he's not already in museums, like statues and things of that nature, especially in Japan?
Absolutely. Outside of Japan, sorry to turn it on its head, there are statues. There's at least one statue I know of in South Africa by a South African artist of Yasuke. Then coming to Japan, within Japan, it's more difficult because he doesn't have a grave. We don't know of a family. We don't know of a surname, so we can't trace back to a specific place, village, town, etc. And normally people who have statues are traced back to a place, and the people of that place have decided to put the money forward to commemorate somebody. So as far as I know, there is no statues of Yasuke yet. However, especially in film and television, he's popping up all the time right now. There's just a few weeks ago, the famous director Kitano Takeshi, or Beat Takeshi as some people know him, his latest movie is about Nobunaga, and Yasuke is quite prominent in this movie. I haven't seen it yet, but I hear that his role is rather crucial to the plot. Perhaps more like the real Yasuke at the time, though I'm not going to say anymore because you have to watch the movie to find it. Anyway, that's common these days. He's popping up all the time in movies, in dramas, in books, newspaper reports. He's become a fairly standard figure in the history of the time.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So Amit Newfield asked, Mr. Lockley, do you know when and how did Yasuke learn Japanese?
There's no definite record of that, but Valiano himself was a big proponent of his underlings learning Japanese and Chinese, for that matter, and even in India, the various Indian languages around the missions where he was, he's an inspector of missions. So he went to these missions, found out he was disgusted that they couldn't speak local languages, and basically forced his missionaries, his underlings, to learn the local languages. Japan was no different, and my supposition is that he himself had learnt Japanese before he came to Japan in Macau, perhaps on the ship as well. And Yasuke may well have benefited from the same lessons that Valiano himself did. Remember, he was Valiano's bodyguard, which means he's Valiano's representative. He's the man that's actually there within a meter or so of Valiano wherever he goes. For Valiano, for Valiano, Yasuke to both look good and sound good would have been very important. So it's not necessarily that he's giving an education to Yasuke for the benefit of the world. He's giving it for his own. But Valiano is giving it for his own benefit. He wants his own servants his own representatives to make him look good. And that was fairly common all over the world at the time, and it's fairly common today as well.
Thank you very much. Rowan Davis asked, what was Yasuke's real name?
Well, we don't know that for definite. There's various options there. One, the name Yasuke could have been just given to him as an honorific name by Nobunaga and have nothing to do with the name that he had before that. That's one option. It's entirely possible. But also the name Yasuke could have derived from an African language or Arabic or an Indian language, for example, Urdu, which is the language of the warriors of Western India at the time in general. And it translates easily to what we would use in English as Isaac, which can be pronounced in many languages between Africa and Japan as Isaki or Isak or Shak, and that could conceivably have moved to Yasuke. There are other options as well, including in the language of Ethiopia, Amharic, there is a name Isaki. It's possible. The answer is we don't know, but what I suspect is that his name was what we would know as Isaac. So
very interesting. Yeah, that's interesting how one name can sound different among different languages. So that's really fascinating. Yeah. Moeka Ida asked, were there non-Japanese / African samurai that came after Yasuke? During your research, did you come across any other Black or African figures that received similar treatment in Japanese history?
Yeah, sure. Especially in the years after Yasuke, in the 1590s, and to a certain extent, the early years of the next century, the 17th century, Japan was experiencing a lot more foreign relations and foreign intercourse, which meant there's a lot more people with skills arriving in Japan, which could be used by local lords, local merchants, or other people who had the means to employ them. Some of these were Africans, some indeed were Europeans. The majority, by a long, long way, were Koreans, and there were some Chinese as well. The Koreans often had been abducted during war and brought to Japan, but their skills meant that they were respected for their skills set, and they were given high status positions within the community. There's only one other record of an African man that I could find of a similarly high status to Yasuke, and this is a man who we don't know his real name, but the Japanese letters refer to him as the Black Man, Kurombo, and he is referred to as a kind of translator interpreter for another lord called I'll remember in a minute which lord it was. He's referred to as an interpreter, a kind of trade advisor, and generally high level ranking lord, person in the entourage of this lord. And the letter that refers to him specifically asks that a different retainer take care of this man's wife and children. So we know that he had a family it was in Kyushu, actually, just near Kumamoto. No.
Very interesting. I hope that, like, as time goes on, some of these stories will become more, I guess, intertwined in Japanese history, because I think it's really interesting to see. What I mean by intertwined with Japanese history is I mean like the history that's shown in school, because I think it's really interesting to see how, Japan, how the different foreign relations that happened prior to the Japan that we know to be today. So
they are. The current curriculum changes over the last few years have been specifically introducing more characters like Yasuke into the curriculum, both within the history curriculum, and also Yasuke himself is actually appearing in one of the major national English textbooks in April. for the first time. His story, there's a whole chapter on him and related issues. I wrote it, so I know quite a lot about it. And there's an interview with me within the chapter talking about Yasuke's life, fairly similar to what we're doing right now as well. So Yasuke is a representative of many peoples, but he's also, through him, other peoples are being recognized as well. So you're absolutely right, and it's already happening.
That's really nice to see that kind of representative in Japanese history and in Japanese books. So the next question comes from Browen Davis. Yasuke was a slave. Was he ever liberated, or was he still a slave while he was a slave?
Well, he might not have been a slave. We don't actually know that for definite. My supposition is that he was originally human trafficked, but there's no actual evidence for that. The pattern was for slaves to be taken as children because they're easily manipulated and trained. Adults were often killed during slave raids, and the children were, or the very youngest people were the people that were trafficked and sold. But there's no specific evidence to say that he was following that pattern. However, by the time he got to Japan, it's highly likely that he was either liberated or his status had simply outgone that of a slave, what we think of as a slave. In those days, the words freedom, liberty, etc. didn't really exist. They didn't have any of the connotations that we have these days. If you didn't have a master, you starved. Everybody had a master, literally. Everybody in a hierarchical society was part of that society as a servant to somebody else, whatever that was. We know about Yasuke, we know that he would have looked what we would think as rich today. His clothes would have been very fine. He was paid. He became rich as well. I think he is more of what we term as a mercenary in modern language than what we would term as a slave. The words don't mean the same thing 400 years ago as they do today. There's just no connotation. Whatever he was, it didn't make that much difference to his destiny, and it also didn't make much difference to his place in society at the time.
That's really, really interesting, especially being from the West. How you compare the fates of various Africans when they left Africa, were taken from Africa in the West compared to Japan. It's really interesting to see how that translates.
The pattern is actually not necessarily a Japanese pattern. It was more of an Indian pattern, and he fitted into that Indian form of status because that's where he would have been trafficked to first. And the patterns of slavery, servitude, human status moved separately across Asia between China and other places, of course, and Japan. But the basic principle of servitude was fairly similar in India as to Japan, and it was perfectly doable for somebody to either buy their way out or just perform their way out of a lower status.
Thank you so much. Harold Enoch Habit asked, so I think you mentioned already, you don't know if there's a Yasuke grave or where Yasuke.
I know there is none. There isn't.
But do we know if we had any kind of descendants?
We don't, because we don't know if he had a surname, or we hadn't got any reference to any partner or children. So it's impossible to say. There are movies, the first of which was about 20 years ago, which had Abe Hiroshi in it, that purports to be about his descendants. And there's this new movie, which I haven't seen, I only found out about yesterday, called Yasuke Descendants, which I presume is about his descendants. But there is a fictional people. There is no proof of any actual descendants.
Interesting. Moeka Ida asked, so how do you feel about Nobunaga's fascination with Yasuke as a Black man? Do you find it disturbing because of the fetishization or do you see it as a positive slash potentially empowering?
The fetishization aspect, I don't know whether that's a reference to how he's portrayed in the movie, just the Takeshi's Beat Takeshi's movie last year. He's, as I understand it, I haven't seen the movie yet. I hear that there is a fair amount of love interest in that movie. I think that if we take out our modern take on these things and we look back at how they were treated 400 years ago, I think we would look at things in different ways. I think we would take it more as a positive. And in fact, the European Jesuits who are writing about this did take it as a positive, and the Japanese diarists and chroniclers 100% took this as an absolute positive as well. This is a man who was worthy of respect because he was him. Didn't necessarily pertain 100% to his skin color, though when we see somebody for the first time, especially when you've never seen somebody of that color before, the first thing you're going to notice is their skin color. That is human nature, especially 400 years ago when you didn't necessarily see people that look different from you very often.
Thank you so much. So Terrence X asked, what was the likelihood that Yasuke became a Ronin after Nobunaga was killed?
Sorry, became a Roman?
Ronin.
A Ronin, as in a masterless warrior. Again, that's something which has been treated in literature, fiction quite a lot. I don't know. I think if somebody had wanted to take some of the gloss of Nobunaga, somebody, for example, in the West, in a long way in the countryside, would have wanted to say, oh, I've got Nobunaga's black. I'm employing Nobunaga's man here. This is his gloss is rubbing off on me. I think that's by far and away the most likely situation. If he survived that battle, and you don't have 100% proof that he did, Terence, then I suspect that he was employed by somebody else. If not immediately, like within a year or so. Yeah. It's an interesting question, and we'll never know the answer. Or if we do, that would be fantastic, but I don't think we would know the answer, unfortunately.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat that bring up India, so I kind of want to combine a couple of questions. So Christine Chung asked, any info on how he went to India from Africa, his birthplace? And then another question asked, I believe it's from Quan Chi, asked, there was mention, there's no, I'm assuming there's an article this person is referring to, but it doesn't mention Yasuke. So maybe Yasuke wasn't African, maybe he was Indian.
Everything that I've seen confirms that he's African rather than Indian. That doesn't necessarily mean that we can say 100% that he wasn't Indian. However, the Jesuit sources at the time and the Jesuit sources afterwards, 50, 60, 70 years afterwards, until he's kind of forgotten, they all call him what the word we would use now, which is derogatory, kafir, as in non-believer. And it's an Arabic word meaning non-believer, non-Muslim. And the Arabs at the time, though that term in itself is not a very good term to use. The people who were Muslims at the time referred to the non-Muslims in Africa as kafirs, or kafro in Portuguese, and that's how it's spelled. And everything referring to Yasuke in Portuguese refers to him by that word. The Japanese don't necessarily use any ethnic words, but they specifically say about how very, very, very dark his skin is. It's the color of ink, and that there's at least two sources that say that. So I would very much say that he was African. How did he get from Africa to India? Well, obviously by ship, but there's two basic routes he could have taken. If he'd come from North Africa, as I suspect he probably did, he would have left from what is now Sudan, one of the ports on the eastern coast of Sudan, perhaps as far north as the Red Sea, but more likely a bit further down. And he would have traveled on a smaller ship, close to the land, perhaps even going via Persia or other states in the area, and ended up in Gujarat. That was the pattern of people from North Africa, whether they be slave or whether they be free, whether they be diplomats from African kingdoms to Indian kingdoms. They followed that route. The Portuguese, on the other hand, came around the tip of southern Africa, and they had several bases in the south of what is now Mozambique, which at the time they only had very tiny forts which they'd taken over, or they had constructed themselves on islands mainly. Mozambique itself refers to an island at this time, not the big state that we know today. They then sailed directly, because there's nowhere in between, or there is, but they didn't know, directly from Mozambique to Goa or Cochin, often to Cochin, which is a bit further south, and then up to Goa, which was their main base, if you like. So there's two possible routes there.
Thank you so much. Do you have time for just one more quick? I'm so sorry.
No problem.
So I want to combine two questions very quickly. So Amit Newfield asked, could you tell us about your method of research and sources for such an ancient story? And Moika Ida asked, how did you first learn about Yasuke, and what set off your research? Or why?
I'm going to start with the beginning. So I'll start with the second question first and then go on to the resources after that. So I came across him by mistake in about 2009. I was doing some research into another foreigner called William Adams from England, who had also achieved samurai status in Japan 20 years later, basically. And at the bottom of the page on Wikipedia, this is how basic it was. You often find external links or connected topics at the bottom of the Wikipedia page. And Yasuke was there. And that's how I met Yasuke, at the bottom of a Wikipedia page. Of course, you can't do research off Wikipedia, or you shouldn't do. So that's when I went into finding more resources. I mean, I didn't do this immediately. This is a project that took me more than 10 years in total. But over time, I looked into the true sources, not just the Wikipedia sources, and we found the artwork as well. We found various interesting asides which don't necessarily refer to Yasuke, but might refer to Yasuke, like the people after he disappears from history, and put those all together, and that became the book. These resources are mainly in Jesuit accounts from letters written by the Jesuits to Europe to report on what they were doing by a man called Louis Fruys. But there are also others in Jesuit accounts, other letters as well. And there are two major Japanese accounts in writing. One is in the biography of Nobunaga from the time, which describes the first meeting. And the second one is in a diary written by a lord called Matsudaira Ietada, who was a cousin of who would later become Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first Tokugawa shogun. Both of them are quite short. They're not very long, but they're full of information. So height, color, status, bam. It's all in there in a couple of sentences.
Thank you so much, Professor Lockley, or Mr. Lockley, for your presentation today and taking time out of your day to be with us. And once again, thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York. Thank you everyone for your awesome questions. There was a lot of questions and I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them today, but thank you so much, Professor Lockley, for your time. Lastly,
I just one thing. If anybody really, really wants to ask a question, they can go to my Facebook page, Thomas Lockley Author, and you can ask it there. So if you can't wait to get that answer, please feel free to do it.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Mr. Lockley, for your time and for presenting with us today. Thank you, everyone, for your awesome questions. We hope that you'll join us next week. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.